Hello, dear friends, and welcome to this quiet corner of the night, where stories unfold like soft petals falling upon still water. I'm so pleased you've chosen to spend these drifting hours with me, here in this gentle space where mysteries whisper rather than shout, and where the shadows hold not fear but fascination. Tonight, we journey together into the fog-bound streets of Victorian London to a tale called The Weeping Woman of Waterloo Bridge, a foggy night investigation. This is a story designed to carry you softly towards sleep, to slow the turning wheel of your thoughts, and to wrap you in the comforting embrace of another time, another place, where gaslight flickers against cobblestones and secrets hide in the mist like shy creatures waiting to be discovered with gentleness and care. Before we begin, I wonder where you might be listening from tonight. Perhaps beneath warm blankets as rain traces delicate patterns against your window, or in a quiet room where the world has finally grown still and soft. Wherever you are, know that you are exactly where you need to be, and that this story will unfold at a pace meant for dreaming, for drifting, for letting go of the day's concerns and surrendering to the peculiar comfort of a mystery that asks nothing of you but your peaceful attention. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain had been falling upon London for 3 days without ceasing, not in violent torrents that cleanse and startle, but in that persistent, whispering manner that turns the great city into something soft and indistinct, as though the entire metropolis had become a watercolour painting, left too long in dampness, its edges blurring, its details melting into shadow and suggestion. It was the 23rd of November in the year 1878, and in the third-floor chambers at 221 Baker Street, a fire crackled with that particular voice that only burning oak possesses, a low, conversational murmur punctuated by occasional pops and hisses, as though the logs were sharing ancient secrets with the flames that consumed them. I sat in my customary armchair, the leather worn smooth by years of contemplation, its surface holding the warmth of my presence, and reflecting it back like a dear friend offering comfort without words. The chair faced the hearth at an angle that allowed me to observe both the hypnotic dance of firelight and the window beyond, where the gas lamps of Baker Street glowed like pale amber beads strung along the darkness, their light diffused and softened by the endless rain until they seemed less like illumination and more like gentle suggestions of human habitation in a world returning to primordial mist. Upon the small table beside my chair rested my evening tea, Darjeeling, prepared precisely as I preferred it, with a single measure of honey and no milk, the liquid a deep amber that caught the firelight and transformed it into something resembling liquid autumn. The cup itself was bone china, delicate but not precious, painted with a pattern of ivy leaves that had faded through decades of use until the green was merely a ghost of its former vibrancy. Steam rose from the tea's surface in lazy spirals, adding its own moisture to the already humid air of the room, carrying with it that distinctive perfume that speaks of distant mountains and careful cultivation, of human hands selecting leaves beneath foreign skies. My companion, Sherlock Holmes, stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, his tall, lean silhouette perfectly still against the rain-streaked glass, as motionless as if he had been a statue commissioned to represent the very concept of patient observation. He had maintained this position for the better part of an hour, watching the street below with that peculiar intensity that characterized his frequent periods of mental idleness. Holmes required stimulation, as other men required food or rest. Without the nourishment of mystery and problem, his remarkable mind turned upon itself, becoming restless and difficult, like a hunting dog confined too long within doors. I smiled into my tea, inhaling the fragrant steam before responding. A philosophical observation from the great rationalist. Shall I record it in my journal alongside your monographs on tobacco ash and the varieties of mud found in London's various districts? He turned slightly, and I caught the brief flicker of amusement that crossed his angular features. Features that might have belonged to a medieval scholar or an ascetic monk, all sharp planes and thoughtful shadows in the firelight. Mock, if you will, my dear fellow, but I have been considering the nature of concealment this evening. The fog that has accompanied this rain creates conditions of remarkable invisibility. One might commit any number of curious actions beneath its cover, unseen by even the most diligent observer. As if summoned by his words, a sound rose from the street below. The distinctive clatter of a hansom cab drawing to an abrupt halt, the horse's hooves sliding slightly on the wet cobblestones, the splash of wheels through puddles that had gathered in the uneven surfaces of the road. Holmes's posture changed infinitesimally, his shoulders drawing back, his head tilting slightly as he tracked the sounds that followed. The opening of the cab door, the hurried payment of the driver, footsteps rapidly approaching our building, the urgent ringing of Mrs. Hudson's bell below. A visitor, I observed unnecessarily, setting down my teacup with a soft clink against its saucer. The sound somehow loud in the suddenly attentive quiet of our rooms. A desperate visitor, Holmes corrected, finally turning from the window to face the door of our chambers, his eyes bright with that peculiar light that indicated his full attention had been engaged. Note the haste with which the cab was dismissed. No instruction to wait, suggesting either supreme confidence in obtaining assistance or such distress as to render practical considerations irrelevant. The footsteps were a woman's. Observe the lighter tread, the more frequent pattern suggesting shorter stride, and she ascended our stairs without pause, indicating either previous familiarity with this address or desperation sufficient to overcome natural hesitation. Indeed, footsteps were now audible upon our own staircase, accompanied by the softer tread of Mrs. Hudson, whose voice carried upward in tones of gentle concern. "Are you quite certain, madam? It is rather late for—" "I must speak with Mr. Holmes immediately," came the reply, a woman's voice indeed, cultured and controlled despite the evident urgency that sharpened its edges. "The matter cannot wait until morning. It simply cannot." Holmes had already positioned himself before the fireplace, adopting that posture of attentive reception he reserved for clients. Hands folded, expression composed into one of sympathetic interest, every line of his body suggesting focused attention. He nodded to me, and I rose from my chair to open the door before Mrs. Hudson could knock, revealing our landlady's concerned face, and, beyond her, the figure of our unexpected visitor. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, dressed in the deep mourning clothes that spoke of recent loss, black crepe and bombazine that seemed to draw the darkness around her like a cloak, making her pale face appear to float in the dim light of the stairwell, like a moon emerging from clouds. Her features were refined, speaking of good breeding and education, but drawn tight with some powerful emotion held barely in check. Rain had spotted her veil and cloak, and I noticed that her gloved hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small reticule to her chest. "Mr. Holmes?" she asked, looking past me to my companion with eyes that held both hope and something darker, something that might have been dread. "I am he," Holmes replied, stepping forward with a gesture that invited her into the warmth of our rooms. "Please, come in from that dreadful weather. Watson, assist the lady with her cloak. Mrs. Hudson, if you would be so kind as to bring fresh tea. Something warming, I think. Perhaps the Assam blend." Our landlady nodded and retreated down the stairs, while I helped the visitor shed her dripping outer garments, hanging them near the fire, where they immediately began to steam gently, adding the scent of wet wool and rain-soaked fabric to the room's atmosphere. Holmes guided the woman to the chair I had vacated, the one closest to the hearth, and she sank into it with a quiet exhalation that spoke of exhaustion, both physical and emotional. "You must forgive this intrusion," she began, but Holmes raised a hand gently, interrupting her with a kindness that he showed rarely, but was nonetheless genuine when it appeared. "No apologies are necessary. You have come through considerable difficulty to reach us, and I perceive that your distress is authentic and substantial. Let us first ensure you are warm and comfortable, and then you may tell us what has brought you to our door at—" He glanced at the mantel clock, which showed 10:30. Such an hour. The woman nodded gratefully, and for a few moments we occupied ourselves with the small rituals of hospitality, the arrival of fresh tea, the pouring of cups, the offering of the sugar bowl and cream pitcher. These simple actions seemed to calm our visitor somewhat, and I found myself appreciating Holmes's instinct in allowing her these moments to gather herself. There was something soothing about the familiar domestic sounds, the gentle clink of spoon against porcelain, the quiet pouring of hot liquid, the soft settling of cups back into saucers. Our guest wrapped both hands around her cup, drawing warmth from it, though she did not yet drink. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the rain continued its persistent whisper against the windows, a sound so constant it had become almost like silence, a backdrop against which other sounds stood out in relief. "My name is Eleanor Ashworth," she began at last, her voice steadier now, though it still carried an undercurrent of distress, like a stream flowing over stones. "Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, widow these past 6 months of Colonel James Ashworth, late of Her Majesty's Indian Service. I live, in a modest house in Belgravia, though I have been considering whether to remain there or return to my family in Yorkshire. The house seems so terribly large now, so full of echoes and emptiness." She paused, and I saw her eyes glisten with tears that she fought to control. Holmes waited with perfect patience, his own expression suggesting gentle attention without prying curiosity. It was a skill I had seen him employ numerous times, the ability to create a space of safety within which a troubled soul could speak freely. "My late husband's sister, Miss Catherine Ashworth, came to live with me after James's death," Mrs. Ashworth continued, her voice growing softer, more distant, as though she were describing something she watched from far away rather than experienced directly. "Catherine was younger than James by some 12 years, barely 32, and had never married. She is a woman of unusual character, deeply thoughtful, prone to melancholy even before her brother's death, given to long walks and longer silences. but we found comfort in each other's company. Two women bound by loss and affection, sharing that too large house with its too many rooms and too heavy memories. Mrs. Hudson moved quietly about the periphery of the room, attending to small tasks that were probably unnecessary, but provided her an excuse to remain and listen. I had long since abandoned any pretense of not attending to Holmes's cases, and I shifted my own chair closer to the fire so that our little group formed an intimate circle, bound together by firelight and the story unfolding in our midst. 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Ashworth continued, her gaze now fixed upon the flames, as though reading her tale in their dancing patterns. Catherine began to behave peculiarly. She would wake in the night, and I would hear her pacing her room, walking back and forth for hours until dawn. She grew pale and distracted, eating little, speaking less. When I pressed her about what troubled her, she would only shake her head and murmur that it was nothing, merely dreams, merely fancies that troubled her sleep. Did she describe these dreams? Holmes asked gently, his fingertips pressed together in that characteristic gesture he adopted when concentrating. Only in the vaguest terms, our visitor replied. She spoke of water, of bridges, of something lost that called to be found. She mentioned Waterloo Bridge specifically, said she felt drawn to it, though she could not explain why. I thought perhaps it was grief taking a new form. The mind plays curious tricks when the heart is wounded, and I tried to distract her with social calls, with theatre visits, with all the gentle diversions one employs to lift a troubled spirit. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a small shower of sparks that glowed briefly before disappearing up the chimney, and the sound seemed to mark a transition in the narrative, a darkening of the tale. But then, 5 nights ago, on the 18th of November, Catherine went out after dinner and did not return, Mrs. Ashworth said, and now her hands trembled so violently that the teacup rattled in its saucer, forcing her to set it down upon the small table beside her chair. She told me she was going to walk, that she needed air and solitude. This was not unusual. She often walked in the evening, but she had never before stayed out past 9 o'clock. When 10 o'clock came and went, I grew concerned. By midnight, I was frantic. I contacted the police, of course, but they were... She paused, searching for a diplomatic phrase. Less than helpful. A grown woman who leaves her house of her own volition, they said, has every right to be wherever she pleases. They suggested that perhaps she had gone to friends, or decided to travel without informing me, or any number of other explanations that might apply to women of less responsible character but were entirely foreign to Catherine's nature. Did she take any belongings with her? I interjected, my medical instincts rising to consider practical details. Luggage, money, personal items that might indicate planned departure. Mrs. Ashworth shook her head firmly. Nothing. Her room remains exactly as she left it. Her nightclothes were laid out upon her bed, as always. Her jewellery, her savings, such as they were, remain untouched. She departed, wearing a walking dress of dark blue wool, a grey cloak, and carrying nothing but her smallest reticule, which would have contained perhaps a handkerchief and a few shillings for a cab fare if needed. She intended to return, Mr. Holmes. Of that I am absolutely certain. Holmes had risen and was now pacing slowly before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in concentration. You have come to me 5 days after her disappearance. What has occurred in the interval? Surely the police conducted some investigation, however cursory. They searched the usual places, hospitals, morgues, Mrs. Ashworth said, and a visible shudder passed through her frame at these grim words. They found nothing. No woman matching Catherine's description had been admitted anywhere, nor had any unfortunate discovery been made. It was as though she had simply dissolved into the fog like a ghost. I made inquiries among her acquaintances, contacted distant relatives, even hired a private investigator recommended by my solicitor, but nothing came of any of it. Catherine had simply vanished. You said this occurred 5 nights ago, Holmes observed, pausing in his pacing to fix our visitor with his penetrating gaze. Yet you come to me only tonight. What has changed? What new information has prompted this visit? Mrs. Ashworth reached into her reticule and withdrew a letter, its envelope already opened, the paper within showing signs of having been read multiple times, its folds worn soft from repeated handling. She held it out to Holmes, who took it with careful fingers, holding it close to the firelight to examine it. This arrived this morning, she explained as Holmes read. It is Catherine's handwriting. I would stake my life upon it, but the content is... She trailed off, her hands fluttering helplessly in her lap. I cannot make sense of it, Mr. Holmes. It frightens me terribly, yet it also gives me hope, for surely it means she lives, though in what circumstances I cannot imagine. Holmes read aloud, his voice measured and clear. Dearest Eleanor, I am well, though I cannot return to you yet. Do not search for me, for I am where I need to be, where I have been called to be. The weeping must be answered. The debt must be paid. When the water has its due, I shall return. Think of me with kindness, and do not grieve. All will be made clear when the time comes. Your loving sister, Catherine. A profound silence followed this reading, broken only by the persistent whisper of rain and the gentle crackle of the fire. Holmes read the letter again silently, then held it close to his face, examining the paper itself, then moved toward the lamp to study it in brighter light. The postmark, he asked, without looking up from his scrutiny. London, posted yesterday afternoon from the district near Waterloo Bridge, Mrs. Ashworth replied. The stationer's mark on the paper is from a common shop. I inquired. The type found on every other street corner. The ink appears ordinary. I have looked for any hidden message, any mark or sign that might reveal more, but I am not skilled in such things. That is why I have come to you, Mr. Holmes. This letter should bring me comfort, proof that Catherine lives, but instead it fills me with unspeakable dread. What can she mean about the weeping, about the water having its due? It sounds like madness, or worse, like someone in the grip of some terrible delusion or compulsion. Holmes returned to the fireplace, holding the letter delicately, his eyes distant with thought. Tell me, Mrs. Ashworth, had your sister-in-law shown any interest in spiritualism, in supernatural beliefs, in mystical philosophies of any kind? The question seemed to surprise our visitor, but she considered it carefully before answering. Catherine was raised in the Church of England, as was I, but she had grown questioning in recent years. She read widely in philosophy and comparative religion. I know she attended several lectures on Eastern mysticism, and she had books on folklore and ancient beliefs. But she was a rational woman, Mr. Holmes, educated and thoughtful. If she had fallen under some charlatan's influence, I believe I would have perceived it. And yet, the language of this letter, Holmes observed, tapping the paper gently, speaks of debts and dues, of being called and answering, of the water requiring something. This is the language of obligation and sacrifice, concepts found in numerous mystical and religious traditions. The reference to the weeping is particularly intriguing. Combined with her previous mention of Waterloo Bridge, we begin to see the outline of something, not yet clear, but suggestive. He turned to Mrs. Ashworth with sudden intensity. "I will take your case, madam. Whatever has drawn your sister-in-law into this mystery, we shall uncover it, and I hope restore her to you safely. But I must know everything, every detail, however small, every conversation, every book she read, every place she visited in the weeks before her disappearance. The human mind does not act without cause, and if we can understand what has captured Catherine's thoughts so completely, we can find her." Relief flooded Mrs. Ashworth's features, and she grasped Holmes's hand impulsively, her gratitude evident in every line of her posture. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Thank you. I will tell you everything I can recall, every small detail, though I warn you, there is much I may have observed without understanding its significance." "That is precisely what I rely upon," Holmes assured her kindly. "The untrained observer often sees more than they know, for they have not yet learned to filter their perceptions through assumptions and theories. Tell me everything, and let me determine what signifies." And so, for the next hour, as the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, and the fire burned lower in the grate, requiring my periodic attention to maintain its warmth, Mrs. Ashworth spoke of her sister-in-law's life in careful detail. She described Catherine's habits and routines, her reading preferences, her small circle of acquaintances, her charitable works, her quiet pursuits. Holmes listened with absolute attention, occasionally interjecting questions that seemed tangential, but which I knew from experience would prove relevant in ways not immediately apparent. Catherine Ashworth emerged from this testimony as a woman of considerable intelligence and sensitivity, deeply affected by her brother's death in a distant land, struggling with questions of meaning and purpose that the loss had awakened in her. She had been particularly disturbed, Mrs. Ashworth revealed, by the manner of her brother's death, a drowning in the Ganges River during what should have been a simple ferry crossing, his body never recovered, buried not in English soil, but in foreign water. Perhaps it did not ease, but rather intensified and focused. Holmes completed her thought gently. Grief can be a powerful lens, concentrating the mind's energy upon particular ideas until they grow from natural mourning into something more consuming. You mentioned that she attended lectures on mysticism. Can you recall any specific topics or speakers? Merivale, Holmes suggested, and when Mrs. Ashworth's face brightened with recognition, he nodded thoughtfully. Professor Theodore Merivale of the Society for Antiquarian Research. Yes, I am familiar with his work, a serious scholar, though his theories tend toward the romantically speculative. He has published extensively on prehistoric ritual practices and water worship. This is a useful connection. The mantel clock chimed midnight, its soft bell-like tones marking the passage into a new day. Mrs. Ashworth started at the sound, glancing toward the window where the darkness was complete, the rain-obscured street lamps providing only the faintest suggestion of light. "I should not keep you longer," she said, gathering herself to rise. "You have been more than generous with your time, and I have at least the comfort now of knowing that someone of your abilities is applying himself to Catherine's disappearance. What should I do? How can I assist? Holmes helped her to her feet with surprising gentleness, his usual brusque manner entirely absent. Return home and rest if you can. Tomorrow I shall call upon you to examine Catherine's room and personal effects. In the meantime, if you recall any additional details, any names or places she mentioned, any unusual letters or visitors, please note them down. The smallest detail may prove illuminating. And Mrs. Ashworth. He paused as she turned back to face him. Do not lose hope. Your sister-in-law's letter, while troubling, suggests someone in full possession of their faculties, however mistaken those faculties might be in their current conclusions. We are not seeking someone overcome by madness or misfortune, but rather someone who has made a choice, however inexplicable it may seem. That gives me reason for optimism. I helped Mrs. Ashworth into her still damp cloak and saw her down to the street, where I was able to hail a passing cab to carry her home to Belgravia. When I returned to our rooms, I found Holmes standing once more at the window, the letter still in his hand, his profile sharp against the dim light from the street. What do you make of it, Holmes? I asked, resuming my seat by the fire, which I stirred back into more vigorous life with the poker, sending sparks dancing up the chimney like tiny stars ascending to their celestial home. I think, he said slowly, that we are dealing with something rather more complex than a simple case of emotional disturbance or even the influence of spiritual charlatans. There is purpose in Catherine Ashworth's actions, Watson. Whatever has drawn her away from her comfortable home and loving family, she believes in it with sufficient conviction to abandon normal life entirely. The question is not whether she is deluded, that seems almost certain, but rather what specific delusion has captured her so completely, and more importantly, whether it places her in immediate danger. He turned from the window and moved to his desk, where he began pulling volumes from his shelves, his commonplace books, his indices of newspaper clippings, his various references on crime, mysticism, and London history. We shall begin first thing tomorrow with an examination of her room and effects, as I told Mrs. Ashworth. But before that, I think a few hours of research are in order. You should retire, my dear fellow. You were nodding over your medical journal earlier, before our visitor arrived. I had to smile at his observation, which was entirely accurate. And you? Will you spend the entire night among your books and clippings? I may nap in my chair, he conceded, but I wish to learn everything I can about water legends associated with Waterloo Bridge, about Professor Merivale's theories, and about any unusual incidents involving women and the Thames in recent months. Somewhere in the intersection of those subjects, we will find the thread that leads to Catherine Ashworth. I left him to his research, knowing from long experience that Holmes in the grip of a new case was as unstoppable as the tide, as focused as sunlight through glass. In my own room, I prepared for bed with the comfortable routine of long habit, but found that sleep, despite my earlier drowsiness, remained elusive. The rain continued its persistent whisper against my window, and in my mind's eye, I kept seeing the fog-shrouded span of Waterloo Bridge, the Thames flowing beneath it in eternal darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, a woman who believed the water called her name and demanded its due. It was a troubling image to carry into dreams, and yet There was something almost hypnotic in its darkness, something that spoke to ancient fears and older stories, to the knowledge that humans have always built their civilizations beside water, and have always, in some portion of their hearts, feared what might dwell within its depths. Outside, London slept its restless sleep, wrapped in rain and darkness, while mysteries old and new wove themselves into the city's fabric, like threads of shadow stitched into a vast and complex tapestry. The morning arrived grey and soft, the rain having finally ceased in the hours before dawn, but leaving behind a city transformed by moisture into something muffled and indistinct, as though the entire metropolis had been wrapped in damp cotton wool. I woke later than my custom. The clock showed past 8, and found Holmes already dressed and seated at the breakfast table, surrounded by papers and volumes, a cup of coffee grown cold at his elbow, his face showing the slightly haggard expression that indicated he had not slept at all. "Ah, Watson," he greeted me without looking up from the newspaper clipping he was studying through a magnifying lens. "Good morning. There is fresh coffee in the pot, and Mrs. Hudson has left us an excellent breakfast, of which I have already partaken. I recommend the kippers. They are particularly fine this morning." I poured myself coffee and examined the breakfast dishes, selecting toast and eggs rather than the recommended kippers, and settled myself at the table with a sense of comfortable routine. This was a familiar pattern. Holmes immersed in research, myself providing practical balance, the morning stretching before us with the promise of investigation and discovery. "Have you slept at all?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "Sleep would have been an inefficient use of time," he replied, finally setting down his magnifying glass and fixing me with eyes that were bright despite their tiredness. "I have instead made excellent use of the night hours. Listen to what I have discovered, Watson, and tell me if you do not find it suggestive." He selected one of his scrapbooks and opened it to a page marked with a slip of paper. First, regarding Waterloo Bridge itself. It was opened in 1817, on the 2nd anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, hence its name, and was originally a toll bridge. However, from almost the moment of its opening, it acquired a rather grim reputation. It became known, somewhat melodramatically, as the Bridge of Sighs, in reference to the Venetian bridge of that name, because of the unfortunately large number of suicides committed from its span. He tapped the page where I could see a newspaper clipping from some years past, its headline reading, "Another Tragedy at Waterloo Bridge." The reasons for this particular bridge's attraction to the desperate are not entirely clear. Other bridges cross the Thames after all, but something about its location, its height, its particular melancholy atmosphere, has made it a site of choice for those wishing to end their earthly troubles in the river's embrace. Over the decades, hundreds have leapt from its parapet into the water below. A chill passed through me, despite the warmth of the coffee in my hands. You think Catherine Ashworth went there with such intentions? I think it possible, but not likely, Holmes replied, turning to another marked page. Her letter suggests ongoing purpose rather than final desperation, but the bridge's history of suicide is relevant to what comes next. Listen to this. He began reading from a yellowed clipping. Local superstition holds that the spirits of those who have perished in the Thames remain attached to the locations of their deaths, and numerous witnesses have reported seeing ghostly figures upon Waterloo Bridge, particularly in conditions of fog or heavy rain. These apparitions are said to be especially visible on the anniversary dates of significant tragedies. He looked up at me significantly. Now, Watson, here is where it becomes particularly interesting. Among the various legends and supposed sightings associated with the bridge, one stands out as particularly persistent. For the past 20 years, there have been recurring reports, never officially investigated, always dismissed as fancy or fraud, of a female figure seen standing upon the bridge late at night, visible only in fog, weeping audibly but never speaking, and apparently searching for something in the water below. Those who claim to have witnessed this apparition describe her as wearing clothing that might date from the 1850s or even earlier, and several witnesses have reported feeling an overwhelming sense of grief and loss when in her presence. I set down my coffee cup, my appetite entirely forgotten. The weeping woman of Waterloo Bridge. Precisely, Holmes confirmed, evident satisfaction in his voice. A urban legend, a ghost story told in pubs and printed in penny dreadfuls. Nothing that would normally warrant serious attention, except... He selected another clipping, this one more recent, dated from just 3 months prior. Except that in August of this year, Professor Theodore Merivale delivered a lecture to the Society for Antiquarian Research, in which he proposed that the legend of the weeping woman might have roots not in Victorian suicides, but in far older practices, specifically in ancient Celtic and pre-Celtic water sacrifice rituals. Holmes began pacing now, his breakfast entirely forgotten, his long fingers gesturing as he spoke, his voice taking on that particular intensity that indicated his mind was making connections at a pace words could barely follow. Merivale's theory, and I must emphasize, it is only a theory with little hard evidence, is that the location now occupied by Waterloo Bridge was significant long before any bridge stood there. He suggests that for millennia since prehistoric times, that particular section of the Thames was used as a ritual site where offerings were made to water deities, and in some cases where human sacrifice occurred. Surely that is pure speculation, I objected, my rational medical training rebelling against such dramatic claims. Ancient rituals beneath modern London? It sounds like romantic fiction. Much of Merivale's work does sound like romantic fiction, Holmes agreed readily, which is why he is respected, but not taken seriously, by more conservative scholars. However, and this is crucial, Watson, his theories are not entirely without foundation. Archaeological evidence does support the existence of water worship among the ancient peoples of Britain. Valuable objects have been dredged from the Thames, weapons, jewellery, religious artefacts that appear to have been deliberately deposited as offerings. And while evidence of actual human sacrifice is considerably more ambiguous, we cannot dismiss it entirely. He returned to the table and selected another document, this one appearing to be notes in his own handwriting. I have here my own observations on Professor Merivale, whom I encountered several years ago during the Baskerville matter. He was consulted regarding prehistoric remains on the moor. He is a scholar of genuine learning, prone to enthusiastic speculation, but not fundamentally dishonest. His lecture on Thames water cults, which Catherine Ashworth attended, apparently made specific reference to the weeping woman legend, suggesting that it might represent not a modern ghost, but rather the vestigial memory of ancient ritual practices, specifically the memory of a priestess or ritual sacrifice associated with the location. And you believe Catherine Ashworth, already troubled by grief and obsessed with water and her brother's drowning, attended this lecture and became fixated upon these ideas? I believe it is highly probable, Holmes confirmed. Consider a sensitive, intelligent woman in a state of profound grief, struggling with guilt that she could not properly mourn her brother because his body was lost to foreign waters, suddenly encounters a compelling narrative that gives meaning and purpose to these feelings. Merivale's theories, however speculative, would have provided her with a framework, a way of understanding her obsession with water, not as morbid fancy, but as connection to something ancient and significant. If she convinced herself that the weeping woman was real, and that this figure was somehow connected to unresolved deaths in the water, to debts that water claims, she might have decided to answer this call, to become somehow involved in this imagined ritual or obligation. I completed his thought, feeling a profound unease settle over me. But Holmes, this is delusion of the most serious kind. If she believes herself called to sacrifice, which is why we must find her quickly, Holmes interrupted, his face grave. Whatever Catherine Ashworth believes, whatever role she imagines herself playing in some ancient drama, the Thames is deadly real, and fog and cold and dark water do not respect the spiritual convictions of those who venture too close to their embrace. We are not seeking a woman who has lost her reason entirely, but rather one whose reason has been bent toward dangerous purposes by grief and unfortunate coincidence. She can be reached, I believe, but we must reach her before... He did not complete the sentence, but its ending hung unspoken in the air between us, heavy with implication. A sharp knock at the door interrupted our conversation, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on her silver tray. Holmes opened it, read it quickly, and his expression darkened. "From the Thames River Police," he said quietly. "A woman's body was pulled from the river near Waterloo Bridge early this morning. She has not yet been identified. Mrs. Ashworth has been contacted to view the remains." He crumpled the telegram in his fist, a rare display of emotion. "We may be too late, Watson." "We should go immediately," I said, already rising from the table, my medical instincts overriding my half-finished breakfast. "Yes," Holmes agreed, reaching for his coat. "Though I confess I have considerable doubt that the body will prove to be Catherine Ashworth. The timing of her letter, posted only yesterday, seems wrong. But we must be certain, and regardless of the victim's identity, a death in the Thames near Waterloo Bridge at this juncture cannot be coincidental. Bring your bag, Watson. Your medical expertise may be required." Within minutes, we had descended to Baker Street, where the morning remained grey and damp, the cobblestones dark with moisture that had not yet evaporated in the weak sunlight, attempting to penetrate the overcast sky. Holmes hailed a cab with his usual efficiency, and soon we were rattling through the streets of London, heading toward the Thames, and whatever grim discovery awaited us there. The journey provided time for thought, and I found myself studying Holmes's profile as he stared out the cab window at the passing cityscape. His expression was remote, concentrated, but I detected beneath his customary analytical demeanour a genuine concern that spoke well of his humanity. For all his professed disinterest in emotional matters, Holmes was not unmoved by the suffering of others, particularly when that suffering involved women or children. His methods might be cold and rational, but his motives often included a strand of authentic compassion that he would have been embarrassed to acknowledge openly. The cab turned along the embankment, and through the misty air I could see the Thames flowing grey and sullen between its banks, its surface disturbed by the traffic of barges and steamers that plied their commercial routes, regardless of weather or tragedy. Waterloo Bridge emerged from the morning haze like a dark giant crouching over the water, its stone span solid and imposing, its 9 great arches framing the river in geometric precision. It was, I had to admit, a melancholy structure, possessing, despite its architectural distinction, a certain oppressive quality, as though it carried the weight of all the sorrows it had witnessed across the decades. Our cab drew up at the northern approach to the bridge, where a small crowd had gathered, the inevitable audience that any tragedy draws in a great city, people whose routines have been interrupted by the spectacle of death, who stand at a respectful distance but cannot quite bring themselves to look away. A constable stood guard at the perimeter, keeping the curious at bay, and beyond him I could see the dark uniform of the Thames River Police and the sombre figures of the coroner's men attending to their grim duties. Holmes presented his credentials, and we were permitted through the barrier, approaching the scene with the practiced casualness of those who have witnessed death many times before. The body had been laid upon a stretcher near the bridge's western parapet and covered with a tarpaulin that bore dark stains, where river water had soaked through the fabric. A police inspector I recognized, Lestrade, as luck would have it, stood nearby, consulting a notebook while speaking with what appeared to be the bridge keeper. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lestrade greeted us with a nod that contained both resignation and relief. "I might have known this would draw your attention. Nasty business, very nasty. Woman in the water is never pleasant, but the circumstances here are peculiar enough that I won't pretend I'm sorry to have your eyes on it." "What are the circumstances?" Holmes asked without preamble, his gaze already sweeping the scene, cataloguing details with that remarkable visual memory that allowed him to reconstruct events from the smallest evidence. Lestrade consulted his notebook. Body was spotted by a bargeman at first light, around 6 this morning, caught against one of the bridge pilings on the downstream side. River police pulled her out within the hour. She had been in the water for no more than a few hours, according to their estimates. Not long enough for significant deterioration, thank heavens. But here is the peculiar part. She was wearing what appears to be some sort of ceremonial garment, and her hands and feet had been bound with cord before she entered the water. A cold finger traced its way down my spine. Murder. That would be the logical conclusion, Lestrade agreed grimly, except that the bindings are curious. Look here. He gestured toward the covered form, and Holmes moved forward, drawing back the tarpaulin with gentle, respectful movements. The woman beneath was young, perhaps 25 or 30, her features peaceful, despite the violence of her death, as though she had accepted what came to her. Her clothing was indeed unusual, a long white garment that might have been a nightdress, or perhaps intended to evoke ancient robes, now stained and darkened by the river water. Around her wrists and ankles were cords of some fibrous material, knotted with deliberate care rather than violent haste. But what struck me most forcefully, and I saw Holmes's sharp intake of breath that indicated he noticed it as well, was the expression on her face. She did not wear the desperate grimace of someone who had fought death, nor the blank emptiness of accident, but rather something that might almost be interpreted as serenity, as acceptance, as though she had approached her fate with something resembling peace or even purpose. "Good Lord," I murmured, and heard my voice as though from a great distance. "It is as if she went willingly." "More than willingly," Holmes said quietly, his fingers gently examining the bindings without disturbing them. These knots were tied with care, with deliberation, and note how the cord has not cut into the skin, has not been strained against violent struggle. "Lestrade, you said the bindings are peculiar. What did you mean specifically?" The inspector cleared his throat uncomfortably. "It is just that our boys from the river police, they have seen any number of drownings, accidents, and otherwise, and they say they have never encountered bindings quite like these. The knots follow no pattern they recognize, and the material of the cord itself is odd. Some sort of plant fiber, they think, rather than manufactured rope. And then there is—" He paused, clearly uncomfortable. "There is the matter of what was found in her pockets." From an evidence bag, Lestrade produced several objects that he spread carefully upon a clean cloth, a small collection of smooth river stones, each painted with what appeared to be primitive symbols, a tarnished coin of ancient appearance, a lock of dark hair tied with thread, and a piece of paper folded many times, protected within a waxed envelope. Holmes examined each item with minute attention, using his magnifying glass on the symbols painted upon the stones, studying the coin from multiple angles, carefully unfolding the protected paper to reveal writing within, lines of verse or perhaps ritual text written in an elegant hand. "Watson," he said, his voice tight with concentration, "look at this writing. Does it resemble the hand in the letter Mrs. Ashworth received from her sister-in-law?" I studied the writing carefully, comparing it mentally to the letter I had heard read the previous night. "There are similarities," I admitted, "but I would not stake my professional reputation on identification from memory. We would need to compare them directly." "That we shall do," Holmes murmured, his attention still fixed on the paper. "But I believe I recognize this hand. This is Catherine Ashworth's writing, or I am much mistaken." A terrible possibility crystallized in my mind. "Holmes, you said you doubted the body would be Catherine's, but this evidence—" "The body is not Catherine Ashworth," Holmes said, with absolute certainty, still examining the dead woman's features. "Note the age. This woman is younger by at least 5 years. Note the hair, light brown where Catherine's is described as dark. Note the hands. These are the hands of someone who has performed manual labor, with calluses and rough skin, not the soft hands of a gentlewoman. No, Watson, this is not Catherine Ashworth. But Catherine Ashworth is connected to this death. Of that I am now certain." "How can you be certain of the connection?" Lestrade demanded, clearly frustrated by Holmes's characteristic habit of reaching conclusions faster than he explained them. "Because," Holmes said, gesturing toward the items Lestrade had displayed, "these objects represent deliberate ritual preparation, and the text on this paper matches almost exactly descriptions I read last night of invocations associated with ancient British water sacrifice rituals. Someone has taken Professor Merivale's academic theories and converted them into practical, lethal action, and someone has done so with knowledge and commitment sufficient to persuade another human being to participate in their own death." The inspector's face had gone pale. Are you saying this woman committed suicide as part of some sort of cult ritual? I am saying, Holmes replied carefully, straightening from his examination and replacing the tarpaulin over the dead woman's peaceful face, that we are dealing with something extraordinarily dangerous, a belief system powerful enough to overcome the most fundamental human instinct for survival. Whether this woman acted entirely alone in her death or had assistance, I cannot yet determine, but given the bindings and the preparation evident in these artifacts, I suspect she had help, and I suspect that help came from someone who believed absolutely in the righteousness and necessity of what they were doing. He turned to Lestrade with unusual urgency. You must search for any identification on the body. Contact all hospitals and asylums within 50 miles of London, asking about recent escapes or unauthorized departures of female patients. Check with spiritualist organizations, mystical societies, anyone who might attract vulnerable people with promises of higher purpose or ancient wisdom. And most urgently, you must send men to Waterloo Bridge tonight, and every night until this matter is resolved. If my theories are correct, this death may not be isolated. You think there will be more? Lestrade asked, his voice heavy with dread. I think that whatever belief system has taken hold in Catherine Ashworth's mind, and has already claimed at least one life, will not be satisfied with a single sacrifice, Holmes said grimly. But we are not without advantages. We know the location, Waterloo Bridge. We know the timing, late night, conditions of fog or rain. And we know that Catherine Ashworth, however misguided her beliefs, maintains enough connection to normal life to write letters and to post them from neighborhood stations. She has not vanished entirely into delusion. She can still be reached and reasoned with if we can find her before the Thames claims what reason remains to her. I found myself looking out over the grey expanse of the river, watching its eternal flow toward the distant sea, and I thought of all the lives it had claimed across the centuries, all the bodies it had carried in its cold embrace, all the grief that had been poured into its waters like an offering to an indifferent god. The Thames was beautiful in its way, essential to London's life and commerce, but in that moment it seemed to me a malevolent presence, ancient and hungry, waiting with patient appetite for its next victim. Come, Watson, Holmes said, touching my arm gently. We must speak with Mrs. Ashworth, and then I have several other inquiries to pursue. Time is not on our side in this matter, and every hour that passes draws Catherine Ashworth deeper into whatever dark current has captured her. We left the scene of the tragedy and returned to our cab, the crowd of onlookers parting to allow our passage, their faces showing that mixture of fascination and horror that death always provokes. As we rattled away from Waterloo Bridge, heading toward Belgravia and our appointment with Mrs. Ashworth, I found myself wondering what we would say to her, how we would explain that her sister-in-law appeared to be involved in a death that bore all the marks of ancient sacrifice and modern madness combined. The city passed outside the cab windows, indifferent to our concerns, continuing its vast daily business of commerce and life. Somewhere in that multitude, Catherine Ashworth moved with purpose that seemed clear to her and incomprehensible to us, drawing closer to whatever fate she believed the weeping woman and the hungry water demanded. And we, armed only with reason and determination, pursued her through the labyrinth of belief and delusion, hoping to reach her before the Thames received its self-appointed due. Mrs. Ashworth's home in Belgravia proved to be a tasteful townhouse on a quiet street lined with plane trees whose bare branches reached toward the grey sky like supplicating hands. The front door was opened by an elderly maid whose red-rimmed eyes and subdued manner indicated she had heard the morning's grim news and feared the worst. She showed us into a drawing room that spoke of comfortable circumstances without ostentation, good furniture worn soft by use, watercolour landscapes on the walls, a pianoforte in the corner bearing sheet music and framed photographs, the whole pervaded by that particular quality of recent grief that no amount of tasteful decoration can entirely disguise. Mrs. Ashworth rose as we entered, her face showing the strain of a sleepless night and the morning's terrible uncertainty. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you have come from... They sent me a telegram asking me to come to identify, but I could not bring myself to go alone, and I was preparing to send word to you when my maid announced your arrival. Is it..." She could not complete the question. "The body is not your sister-in-law's," Holmes said immediately, and I saw Mrs. Ashworth's legs nearly buckle with relief, so profound she had to grasp the back of a chair for support. "Please sit down. You have had a terrible shock, and what I must tell you is distressing in different ways. But you must not fear that Catherine has been found dead. She lives. Of that I am now more certain than before, though the circumstances surrounding her disappearance have become significantly more complex and troubling." We spent the next few minutes administering the practical comforts. Tea ordered, a chair drawn close to the fire, time given for Mrs. Ashworth to compose herself and prepare to hear what Holmes had to tell her. When finally she indicated her readiness, Holmes explained with his customary clarity what we had learned, showing her the letter found on the drowned woman, allowing her to confirm that it was indeed Catherine's handwriting, and gently outlining the connections we had drawn between Professor Merivale's lecture, the legend of the weeping woman, and the tragedy on the Thames. To her credit, Mrs. Ashworth listened with remarkable composure, her intelligence engaging with Holmes's reasoning, even as her heart must have been screaming in protest against the implications. When Holmes fell silent, she sat quietly for a moment, staring into the fire before speaking. "You are telling me that Catherine has become involved, has perhaps orchestrated, a death, believing herself to be fulfilling some ancient ritual obligation," she said slowly, as if testing the words for truth. "That she has taken academic theory and transformed it into lethal practice. That she has somehow persuaded another woman to die in the Thames as a sacrifice to... what? To a ghost? To an ancient water deity? To her own grief transformed into religious mania? Those are possibilities we must consider," Holmes confirmed gently. "Though I hasten to add that we do not yet know the full circumstances of this morning's death. It is possible, though I confess unlikely, that the drowned woman acted entirely alone, that Catherine's involvement is limited to providing the ritual framework and text, but not the actual act. Until we identify the victim and understand her background and connections, we cannot be certain." Mrs. Ashworth rose and moved to a small writing desk near the window, from which she withdrew a key. "You said you wished to examine Catherine's room and belongings. I shall show you myself. Perhaps there is something there that will explain..." She trailed off, the sentence incomplete, but its meaning clear. Perhaps there was something that would explain how a rational, educated woman had descended into such darkness. We followed her up a staircase adorned with portraits of family members, stern colonels and gentle wives, children frozen in Victorian solemnity, all watching with painted eyes as we ascended toward the room that had belonged to the missing woman. Mrs. Ashworth unlocked a door at the end of the first-floor corridor and stepped aside to allow Holmes entry. The room beyond was precisely what one might expect of an unmarried woman of good family and limited means, comfortable but not luxurious, furnished with pieces that had clearly been selected for their personal significance rather than their fashionable appeal. A narrow bed with a white coverlet, a wardrobe of dark wood, a washstand with pitcher and basin, a writing desk positioned near the window to catch the best light, bookshelves filled to overflowing with volumes of all sizes and conditions, a dressing table bearing modest cosmetics and jewellery. It was the room of someone who lived primarily in her mind, for whom material comforts were secondary to intellectual and spiritual pursuits. Holmes stood in the centre of the room for a long moment, simply observing, his remarkable eyes moving systematically across every surface, taking in the whole before examining the parts. Then he began his investigation in earnest, and I watched as he employed those methods I had witnessed countless times, but never ceased to find impressive. The minute examination of surfaces for traces invisible to normal sight, the careful sorting of papers and correspondence, the systematic evaluation of what was present and, equally significantly, what was absent. The bookshelves claimed his attention for some time, and he read off titles as he examined them. Works on comparative religion, folklore of the British Isles, Celtic mythology, archaeological reports on Thames discoveries, volumes of poetry focused on water and drowning, medical texts on drowning and recovery, spiritualist treatises, mystical philosophies. He pulled out one volume that had clearly been consulted frequently, its spine cracked, its pages bearing marginal notes in Catherine's hand. Here we have Professor Merivale's Sacred Waters, Ritual and Sacrifice in Ancient Britain, published just last year, and it has been annotated extensively. Listen to this passage that Catherine has underlined. The river was understood not merely as physical water, but as a liminal space between worlds, and those who offered themselves to its embrace were believed to become intermediaries between the living and the dead, their sacrifice ensuring cosmic balance. He closed the book with a soft thump that seemed loud in the quiet room. Here is the seed of the belief that has taken root in Catherine Ashworth's grief-damaged mind. The idea that drowning is not death but transformation, not ending but beginning. For someone mourning a brother lost to water, someone tormented by the inability to properly grieve or memorialize him, this concept would possess terrible seductive power. Mrs. Ashworth stood in the doorway, her handkerchief clutched in her hand, though she had not yet wept. But surely she cannot truly believe such things. Catherine was raised in the church, educated in reason and science. How could she abandon everything she knew for this? Grief is a powerful alchemist, I offered gently, speaking from my experience as a physician who had sat beside many deathbeds and consoled many mourners. It can transform the most rational mind, can make attractive any belief that promises relief from unbearable pain. Your sister-in-law did not abandon reason for madness, but rather bent reason to serve an emotional need so powerful it overwhelmed all other considerations. Holmes had moved to the writing desk and was examining papers there, correspondence, journals, sketches of what appeared to be prehistoric artifacts and ritual diagrams copied from various sources. He held up one letter bearing a university seal. Here is correspondence from Professor Merivale himself, responding to inquiries Catherine sent him after his lecture. He is encouraging in his response, too encouraging perhaps, validating her interest in his theories, suggesting additional sources she might consult, and... Holmes paused, reading more carefully, and mentioning that he would be interested in hearing her thoughts on potential fieldwork relating to Waterloo Bridge legends. Good God, the man has no idea what he has set in motion. His academic enthusiasm has fed a dangerous obsession. He continued his methodical search, pulling out drawers, examining wardrobes, investigating every corner of the room with painstaking thoroughness. In the bottom of a trunk that held blankets and winter clothing, he found a wooden box that had been carefully wrapped in cloth. He carried it to the bed and opened it gently, revealing its contents to our view. Inside were items that sent a chill through the warm room. Lengths of the same fibrous cord we had seen binding the drowned woman's wrists and ankles. Small jars containing what appeared to be paint or dye. Several smooth stones, not yet marked with symbols, but clearly selected for that purpose. More ancient coins, similar to the one found on the victim. Bundles of dried herbs bound with thread. And most disturbing of all, a journal filled with Catherine's neat handwriting, its pages documenting what could only be described as ritual preparations. Holmes read from this journal aloud, his voice carefully neutral. The first offering must be made at the dark of the moon, when the water is at its highest and the veil is thinnest. The chosen one must go willingly, must embrace the transformation with full knowledge and acceptance. The bindings are not restraints, but symbols of covenant, representing the ties that bind us to this world, which must be acknowledged before they are severed. The stones carry the marks of passage, the old symbols that our ancestors knew, that speak to the water of intention and purpose. When these offerings are made with proper knowledge and reverence, the weeping will cease, the debt will be paid, and those lost to water will find their peace. A terrible silence followed these words. Mrs. Ashworth had gone pale as milk, one hand pressed to her mouth as though to hold back a cry. Holmes closed the journal carefully and looked up at both of us. Catherine Ashworth has constructed an entire theology of water sacrifice, blending Merivale's theories with her own grief and with elements drawn from spiritualism, ancient paganism, and simple creative imagination. She has convinced herself that by recreating these ancient practices, she can somehow provide for her brother's spirit what his water burial in the Ganges could not: proper ritual attention, acknowledgement by the water deities, passage to peaceful rest, and in service of this belief, she has become extraordinarily dangerous. But who was the woman who drowned? Mrs. Ashworth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Who would consent to such a thing? That is the question we must answer, Holmes replied, rising from the bed and carefully gathering several items from the box. The journal, samples of the cord and stones, letters from Merivale. But I can make some educated surmises. The victim was young, likely troubled in some way, vulnerable to the promise of higher purpose or spiritual meaning. Perhaps she was ill, or in despair, or simply susceptible to the personality of someone like Catherine Ashworth, who can be quite compelling when she believes absolutely in her cause. We must find how they met, where Catherine has been staying these past 5 days, and most critically, whether there are other vulnerable souls she has drawn into her web of belief. At that moment, the sound of the front door opening reached us from below, followed by the maid's voice, raised in surprise or protest, and then rapid footsteps ascending the stairs. We turned toward the doorway as a figure appeared there, a man of middle years, dressed in the slightly rumpled tweeds of an academic, his hair wild, his eyes behind spectacles showing acute distress. "Mrs. Ashworth," he gasped, clearly out of breath from rapid travel and stair climbing. "I came as soon as I heard. The police called upon me this morning with questions about my lecture and theories, and when they mentioned Catherine's name in connection with a death on the Thames, I knew. I feared." He stopped, finally noticing Holmes and myself. "Forgive me, I am Theodore Merivale. I have been told that Miss Catherine Ashworth has disappeared, and that her disappearance may be connected to my work, and I cannot tell you how this news has distressed me, how responsible I feel." Holmes moved forward, extending his hand to the agitated professor. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and my colleague, Dr. Watson, your timing is excellent, Professor Merivale. We have many questions for you, and I suspect you have considerable information that will prove valuable in locating Catherine Ashworth before this situation deteriorates further." We reconvened in the drawing room below, where the maid brought fresh tea, and the four of us arranged ourselves around the fire, Holmes and myself on one settee, Mrs. Ashworth and Professor Merivale in facing armchairs, the domestic setting providing strange counterpoint to the dark matters we discussed. Merivale proved to be precisely as Holmes had described him, an enthusiastic scholar of genuine learning, but perhaps insufficient caution in considering the real-world implications of his theories. "I never imagined," he said, his distress evident in every word, "that my academic work could be interpreted as instruction for actual practice. My lecture on Thames water cults was intended as historical reconstruction, as speculation about the beliefs of long-vanished peoples. When I discussed sacrifice and ritual, I was describing practices that ended centuries, if not millennia ago. To think that someone might attempt to revive them." He removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes wearily. Miss Ashworth attended my lecture and approached me afterward with thoughtful questions. I was pleased by her engagement with the material, flattered by her evident interest. We corresponded several times, and I recommended sources for further study. She seemed an intelligent and serious student of the subject, and I had no reason to suspect her interest was anything but scholarly. But looking back now, I can see warning signs I missed. The intensity of her questions about the mechanics of sacrifice, her focus on the emotional and spiritual states of those who participated, her apparent need to understand not just what happened, but why, what purpose these practices served, what comfort they provided. "When did you last hear from her?" Holmes asked, his fingers steepled in that characteristic pose, his eyes fixed on Merivale with penetrating attention. "Approximately 3 weeks ago," Merivale replied, consulting a small diary he pulled from his pocket. "Yes, here, November 3rd. She wrote asking whether I knew of any locations in London where water sacrifice rituals might have occurred, whether the Thames itself might have served such purposes in antiquity. I responded that while specific locations are difficult to pinpoint after so many centuries of urban development, it was entirely plausible that the Thames had served ritual functions, particularly at river crossings or locations of natural significance. I mentioned, God forgive me, that Waterloo Bridge's reputation for melancholy and death might indicate it stood upon a site with long associations to mortality and water, that perhaps the modern suicides were unknowing echo of ancient practices. He looked up, his face anguished. I was engaging in precisely the sort of romantic speculation I am professionally known for, finding mystical connections between past and present. It never occurred to me that I was providing practical guidance for revival of lethal practices. Holmes's expression was not unkind, but neither did it absolve the professor of responsibility. The scholar's obligation includes anticipating how their ideas might be interpreted by vulnerable minds. However, self-recrimination is unproductive at present. What we require from you now is detailed knowledge of the practices Catherine Ashworth believes she is recreating. If we understand the ritual structure she is following, we may be able to anticipate her next actions. For the next hour, as the afternoon light grew dimmer beyond the windows and the fire was built up against the growing chill, Professor Merivale explained in careful detail what his research had uncovered about ancient water sacrifice practices. He described the timing, rituals conducted at significant astronomical moments, particularly dark moons and solstices. He outlined the preparation, the selection of offerings, which in the case of human sacrifice involved willing participants who were honored rather than coerced, who went to their deaths believing they served their community and would be transformed rather than simply killed. He discussed the items that would accompany such offerings: stones marked with protective and transitional symbols, herbs associated with death and passage, personal objects that connected the sacrifice to their previous life and their future transformation. The critical element, Merivale explained, is consent and understanding. In ancient practice, those who served as sacrifices were not victims in the modern sense, but willing participants in what was understood as necessary cosmic exchange. The community's survival depended on maintaining proper relationship with the forces of nature, and sacrifice was the price of that relationship. Those who paid that price were honored, remembered, believed to continue in transformed existence as intermediaries between worlds. Catherine's letter spoke of the weeping. Holmes interjected. What would that signify in this context? Merivale frowned thoughtfully. In some water cult traditions, there are references to the mourning of the goddess or divine force associated with the water, grief for the loss of sacrifices, or perhaps grief at the necessity of requiring them. The offering is meant not only to honor the water power, but to comfort it, to provide company in its eternal loneliness. There are fragments of poetry and ritual text that speak of ending the weeping, suggesting that proper sacrifice brings peace not only to the sacrificed, but to the divine recipient of the offering. A piece clicked into place in my mind. The weeping woman of Waterloo Bridge. Catherine believes this figure is a manifestation of the water, goddess or spirit, weeping for offerings not received, for rituals not performed. She believes that by reviving these practices, she can comfort this spirit and, by extension, provide the ritual care for her brother that his foreign death denied him. Precisely, Holmes confirmed. It is quite mad, of course, by any rational standard, but it possesses internal logic, and that internal logic will guide her actions. Professor Merivale, in these ancient practices, Would a single sacrifice suffice? Or would multiple offerings be required? The professor's face went grave. That would depend on the specific tradition and the purpose of the sacrifice. For major purposes, ending drought, ensuring harvest, preventing plague, multiple sacrifices might be offered over a period of time, each one building upon the previous, creating a cumulative effect. Given Catherine's stated purpose of ending the weeping and settling debts to the water, and given the multiple losses the Thames has witnessed, he did not complete the thought, but his meaning was clear. She will not stop with one death, I said heavily. She will continue until she believes the goddess is satisfied, until the weeping ceases, which, being a delusion, will never occur. Holmes added grimly, the weeping woman is legend, not reality. No actual spirit will signal satisfaction because no actual spirit exists to receive offerings. Catherine will continue her terrible work indefinitely unless we stop her. Mrs. Ashworth, who had been silent throughout this exchange, her face showing the strain of hearing her sister-in-law discussed as both victim and perpetrator of horror, finally spoke. How do we stop her? She is convinced of her righteousness, armed with belief that overrides all moral prohibition and self-preservation. She has already persuaded at least one person to die. How do we reach someone so far from reason? Holmes rose and moved to the window, staring out at the gathering dusk, the gas lamps beginning to glow in the street outside. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost gentle. We do not reach her through reason, at least not directly. Delusion that has replaced reason cannot be defeated by logical argument. But we may reach her through the very beliefs that drive her. If she believes herself engaged in sacred work, believes herself serving higher purposes and ancient obligations, then we must confront her within that framework. We must show her that her actions, rather than honouring the water and comforting the weeping goddess, are in fact violations of the very traditions she seeks to uphold. He turned back to face us, and I saw in his expression that peculiar intensity that indicated a plan forming. Professor Merivale, in authentic ancient practice, would these rituals be conducted by a single individual or by a community with priests or priestesses serving official roles? Always community-based, Merivale responded immediately. Water sacrifice was far too significant to be individual action. It required ritual specialists to ensure proper procedure, community witnesses to validate the act, elaborate preparation to maintain sacred space. A solitary practitioner conducting such rituals would be violating the essential nature of the tradition. It would be seen as presumptuous, even blasphemous. A slight smile crossed Holmes's features. Excellent. Then we have our angle of approach. We will challenge Catherine's authority to conduct these rituals, question her legitimacy as ritual practitioner, and suggest that her actions, far from honouring ancient tradition, are actually offensive to the powers she seeks to appease. If we can introduce doubt into her belief system, we may create an opening for reason to reassert itself. But first, we must find her, I pointed out practically. She could be anywhere in London. No, Holmes corrected. She could be anywhere near Waterloo Bridge. That is her sacred site, the location where all her activity must centre. She will have found lodgings nearby, some place that allows her to watch the bridge, to observe conditions, to approach it regularly without attracting undue attention. Professor, you mentioned that sacrifice timing relates to astronomical events. When is the next significant moment according to these traditions? Merivale consulted his diary again, checking dates against some mental calculation. The dark of the moon, the new moon, occurs tomorrow night, November 25th. That would be considered highly auspicious for offerings, particularly in the late autumn season, when the year moves toward its death. If Catherine is following ritual calendar, tomorrow night would be when she attempts her next sacrifice. Holmes completed the sentence, which gives us less than 30 hours to locate her, understand the full scope of her plans, and devise an intervention that will save both potential victims and Catherine herself. A considerable challenge, but not, I think, an impossible one. He moved to the center of the room, and I recognized the energy in his posture that indicated his mind was fully engaged, running through possibilities and strategies at remarkable speed. Here is what we shall do. Mrs. Ashworth, you will remain here and wait. If Catherine contacts you again, you must engage her in conversation. Discover as much as you can about her location and plans without arousing her suspicion. Tell her you wish to understand, that you want to help. Whatever maintains connection. Professor Merivale, you will return home and prepare a document, a scholarly paper, if you will, that thoroughly discredits the practice of solitary water ritual, citing ancient sources as much as possible. Make it compelling and authoritative. We may need to use your academic credibility to shake Catherine's certainty. He turned to me. Watson, you will come with me. We have several tasks before us. First, we must speak again with Lestrade and ensure that police surveillance of Waterloo Bridge is both subtle and comprehensive. Then, we must canvass the area around the bridge, searching for lodging houses, spiritualist meeting rooms, anywhere Catherine might have established her base of operations. We are looking for a woman who would keep irregular hours, who might receive visitors at odd times, who might be known for intense or unusual conversations. Someone will have noticed her. Someone always notices. As if in response to his words, a sharp knock sounded at the front door below. We heard the maid's steps, the door opening, a brief exchange of voices, and then the maid's rapid ascent to the drawing room. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," she said, slightly breathless, "but there is a young woman at the door, asking for Mrs. Ashworth specifically. She says she has urgent information about Miss Catherine, and she will speak only with the lady of the house. She seems, if I may say so, ma'am, she seems quite frightened." Holmes and I exchanged glances. "Show her up immediately," Holmes instructed, "and remain nearby in case she requires assistance or restraint." The maid withdrew, returning moments later with a girl of perhaps 20 years, poorly dressed but clean, her face showing the pinched look of chronic hunger and inadequate rest. She clutched a worn shawl around her shoulders and looked around our assembled group with eyes that held both fear and desperate hope. "Mrs. Ashworth?" she asked, fixing on the lady of the house with pleading expression. "I am Mary Garrett, and I have come to warn you about your sister-in-law. She is in terrible danger, and she is putting others in danger, and I don't know what to do or where to turn. But I heard the police were asking questions about a woman who drowned, and I knew it must be poor Annie, and I couldn't stay silent any longer, even though I promised I wouldn't tell, even though Miss Catherine said it was sacred work, and I mustn't interfere." The words tumbled out in a rush, powered by guilt and terror, and Holmes moved forward gently, guiding the girl to a chair, signaling for tea to be brought. allowing her a moment to catch her breath and compose herself before the questions would inevitably begin. "You know Catherine Ashworth," Holmes said gently. "You know what she has been doing. Tell us everything, Miss Garrett. Tell us from the beginning, and take your time. You are among friends here, and no harm will come to you for speaking honestly." And so, as the November darkness gathered beyond the windows and the fire burned low in the grate, Mary Garrett told her story, and with each word, the full scope of Catherine Ashworth's delusion became horrifyingly clear. Mary Garrett was a girl of the unfortunate class who inhabit London's margins, neither destitute enough for the workhouse nor prosperous enough for security, surviving through irregular employment and the uncertain charity of the slightly more fortunate. She worked when she could find work, as a laundress, as a kitchen maid, as flower seller on prosperous streets, where ladies took pity and gentlemen made small, generous gestures. She lived in a boarding house near the Waterloo Road, one of those establishments where respectability was maintained by stern rules and low rent, where a dozen women of small means shared cramped rooms and common hardships. It was at this boarding house, she explained in halting sentences, punctuated by sips of hot tea, that she clutched like a lifeline, that Catherine Ashworth had taken a room 6 days ago, arriving with a small bag and a request for the cheapest accommodation available. She seemed a proper lady, Mary said, her voice soft with the particular accent of South London, her words carefully chosen as though she feared judgment for poor expression. Not the usual sort we get at Mrs. Blackwood's establishment. But she paid a week in advance and asked for a room that overlooked the river, said she needed to be near the water for her work. Mrs. Blackwood thought she might be one of them lady missionaries or reformers, come to study the poor and write about their conditions, so she gave her the attic room that has the best view of the Thames and Waterloo Bridge. "And you became acquainted with her?" Holmes prompted gently when Mary paused, gathering strength for what came next. "She sought me out particular-like," Mary confirmed. "Second day she was there. She came to the kitchen where I was helping with laundry and asked if she might speak with me. We went to her room, and she was so kind, so interested in my life and my troubles. She asked about my family, all dead now, of fever and accidents, and just the ordinary cruelties that take the poor, and about my circumstances and my hopes. I told her I often felt there was no purpose to the struggle, that I wondered sometimes if it wouldn't be easier to just step into the river and let the water take me, end the endless grinding effort of survival." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I shouldn't have said such things. I shouldn't have spoken my despair aloud. But she seemed to understand, and she didn't judge or scold, or offer useless platitudes about God's purpose and heavenly reward. Instead, she told me about ancient times, about peoples who saw death not as end, but as transformation, about water as sacred portal between worlds. She said that for those who had no place or purpose in this world, there was the possibility of finding both in the next, of becoming something sacred and honoured, instead of remaining something disposable and forgotten. Tears tracked down Mary's thin cheeks, though she seemed unaware of them. She made it sound beautiful, Mr. Holmes. She made drowning sound like transcendence instead of despair. And she said she knew others who felt as I did, who were tired of suffering and ready for transformation. She said there was a group of us who met in the evenings, who shared our burdens and studied the old ways together, and would I like to join them? "And you did," Mrs. Ashworth said softly, her own eyes bright with unshed tears for both her misguided sister-in-law and for this desperate girl she had drawn into darkness. "I did," Mary confirmed. "There were 5 of us, all women, all poor or troubled in some way. There was Annie Fletcher, who had a wasting disease and was in constant pain, who had no money for doctors or medicine, who welcomed the idea of a death that had meaning instead of lingering agony. There was Sarah Cole, who had been violated by her employer and cast out when her condition became known, who felt her life was ruined beyond recovery. There was Margaret Thorne, who was simple-minded and had been used cruelly by everyone she trusted, who craved any kindness, even from a source she barely understood. And there was Judith Ward, who is, like me, just tired, Mr. Holmes, just worn down to nothing by the struggle to exist. The catalogue of suffering hung heavy in the air, a testament to the invisible tragedies playing out in countless lives across the vast city. Fertile ground for anyone offering hope, however twisted its form. Miss Catherine taught us about the old rituals, Mary continued, her voice growing steadier now that the worst of her confession had begun. She showed us texts and symbols, taught us songs in languages none of us knew, told us about the weeping woman who waited on Waterloo Bridge for those brave enough to answer her call. She said we would be priestesses and sacrifices both, that we would serve the sacred purposes our own time had forgotten, that we would be remembered and honoured for our courage, and most powerfully, Mr. Holmes, she said we would find peace, the peace that had been denied us in life, the peace that the water could provide if we came to it properly, with preparation and ritual and willing hearts. "The woman who drowned this morning," Holmes said gently, "that was Annie Fletcher." Mary nodded miserably. Annie was the first to volunteer. Her pain had become unbearable, and Miss Catherine's promise of transformation seemed like the only escape available to her. We prepared her according to the rituals, the binding cords, the marked stones, the herbs and coins. Miss Catherine wrote out the proper words on paper and sealed them in wax so they would survive the water. And last night, when the fog was thick and the bridge was empty, we all walked together to the centre span, and Annie spoke the words of offering, and her voice broke entirely. We helped her over the railing. We watched her fall into the darkness. We heard the splash. Miss Catherine said prayers in the old language, and then we returned to the boarding house and waited for word of Annie's transformation, of the weeping woman's acceptance of her offering. A profound silence filled the room. Professor Merivale had gone pale as chalk, confronting the lethal reality his theories had inspired. Mrs. Ashworth wept quietly, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth. I felt sick, imagining the scene. Desperate women standing in fog on the ancient bridge, committing murder with love and ritual sanction, believing themselves participants in sacred drama while performing simple tragedy. But something changed for you, Holmes observed, his voice carefully controlled. Something made you doubt, made you come here today with your warning. What was it, Miss Garrett? Mary raised her eyes to meet his, and in them I saw the fundamental sanity that had survived despite everything, the core of self-preservation that superstition and desperation had almost but not quite extinguished. This morning, when we heard about the body being found, Miss Catherine said we should rejoice, that Annie had been accepted by the water and transformed. But I saw her face, Mr. Holmes. I saw Annie's face when they pulled her from the river and laid her on the bridge. They didn't cover her immediately, and I was in the crowd watching, and I saw her. And she didn't look transformed. She didn't look transcendent or peaceful or honoured. She just looked dead, Mr. Holmes. Dead and cold and wasted, like all the other poor souls who end up in the Thames. And I thought, what if there is no transformation? What if Miss Catherine is mad or mistaken, and we have murdered Annie Fletcher for nothing more than beautiful words and ancient lies? She stood suddenly, agitation overwhelming her fragile composure. And tonight, Mr. Holmes, tonight they plan to do it again. The dark of the moon is tomorrow, and Miss Catherine says we must make the second offering tonight in preparation, that Sarah Cole has volunteered to go next, and they are preparing her now, back at the boarding house, binding the cords and marking the stones. I came here because I could not bear to watch another death, could not bear to help push another woman into the river, no matter what promises of peace and transformation are made. I came because I am a coward or a traitor, or whatever else they will call me, but I could not do it again. Holmes was on his feet instantly, moving with sudden urgency that transformed the drawing room from place of contemplation to headquarters of action. Watson, we must move immediately. Mrs. Ashworth, send word to Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard. Tell him to bring men to Waterloo Bridge by 10 o'clock tonight, but to remain hidden until signalled. Professor Merivale, that document I requested must wait. I need you to come with us. Your authority as scholar may be our best weapon in breaking Catherine's hold over these women. Miss Garrett, you have shown tremendous courage in coming forward, and I will need you to guide us to this boarding house, and to help us approach without alarming Catherine or causing her to accelerate her plans. He pulled on his coat, and I saw his features set in that expression of absolute determination that appeared when he was racing against time to prevent tragedy. The game is afoot, Watson, and the stakes are human lives, both the intended victim and the victimizers who do not fully comprehend what they do. We have perhaps 6 hours before this second offering is attempted. That must be enough. Within minutes, we had assembled in the front hall. Holmes, myself, Professor Merivale, and young Mary Garrett, who had wrapped her worn shawl tighter against the evening chill, and squared her thin shoulders with remarkable courage. Mrs. Ashworth stood at the door, her hand clasping mine briefly as we departed. "Bring her back to me," she whispered. "Bring Catherine back from wherever this madness has taken her. She is not evil, Mr. Holmes, only terribly, terribly lost." We travelled by cab to the Waterloo Road, that busy thoroughfare that connects the bridge to the dense warrens of Southwark beyond. Mary directed us to a narrow street that branched off the main road, lined with tall, thin buildings that leaned against each other like exhausted workers at day's end. Halfway down this street stood Mrs. Blackwood's boarding house, distinguishable from its neighbours only by a small placard beside the door advertising respectable lodgings for working women. Holmes paid the cab and dismissed it, preferring that we approach on foot, with stealth rather than announcement. Mary led us to a service entrance at the rear of the building, explaining that the front door was locked after 8 o'clock, and that late arrivals used the kitchen entrance, where Mrs. Blackwood's daughter kept intermittent watch. "Miss Catherine's room is at the very top," Mary whispered as we gathered in the darkened alley behind the building. There are 4 flights of stairs, and they creak something terrible, so she'll likely hear us coming. But if I go first, she'll think it's just me returning, and I can call out some excuse about forgetting something or needing to speak with her. That might get us to her door without alarm." Holmes considered this plan and nodded approval. "Excellent. You will go first, and we will follow at a distance of 1 flight, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to avoid immediate detection. When you reach her door, engage her in conversation if you can, keeping her attention on you and away from the stairwell. We will enter when I judge the moment appropriate. Professor Merivale, you must be prepared to speak with scholarly authority about authentic ritual practice and Catherine's violations of proper form. Dr. Watson, you must be ready to provide medical assessment if anyone shows signs of distress or hysteria. I shall manage the overall confrontation. Is everyone clear on their roles?" We murmured agreement, and Mary opened the rear door with practiced familiarity, revealing a dim corridor that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp stone. She moved forward into the building's interior, and we followed like shadows, ascending stairs that did indeed creak alarmingly, passing closed doors behind which the building's inhabitants lived their private lives, climbing higher into the structure until the air grew noticeably colder and the ceiling lower. At the 4th floor landing, Mary paused, turning back to where we waited 1 flight below, her face barely visible in the faint light from a candle stub burning in a wall sconce. She gestured upward, indicating that Catherine's room lay just above, then mounted the final flight of stairs with heavy, deliberate footsteps that would announce her approach. Holmes held up his hand, signaling us to wait, listening intently to the voices above. Catherine's response was indistinct, but seemed to express welcome and invitation. We heard footsteps crossing a room, the creak of furniture, the settling of conversation. Holmes waited perhaps 30 seconds more, then began ascending the final flight with movements so quiet I could barely hear them, despite following close behind. The attic door stood partially open, and through the gap I could see a room lit by candles that cast dancing shadows on sloped walls. Catherine Ashworth stood near a small table, her back partially to the door, gesturing as she explained something to Mary Garrett, who had positioned herself to maintain clear sight of the doorway. The room was crowded with evidence of Catherine's obsessions. Papers covered in symbols pinned to the walls, books stacked on every surface, bowls containing herbs and stones, lengths of cord arranged with ritual precision. And seated on the room's only bed, looking terrified but resigned, was another young woman who must be Sarah Cole, already dressed in the white sacrificial garment, her hands and feet not yet bound, but the cords lying ready beside her, awaiting the hour when she would walk to the bridge and surrender her life to Catherine's delusions and the Thames's indifferent embrace. Holmes stepped through the doorway, his presence filling the small room, despite his physical slenderness. "Miss Catherine Ashworth," he said, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and I have been engaged by your sister-in-law to locate you and bring you home. This ritual practice you have undertaken must cease immediately. You are in violation not only of the law, but of the very traditions you believe yourself honouring." Catherine spun to face him, her expression cycling through surprise, recognition, and settling finally on a strange calm that was almost serene. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "I have heard of you, of course. Your methods are famous, but you cannot investigate this with reason alone, for what we do here transcends reason. We serve purposes older than law, deeper than convention. You would not understand. On the contrary, Professor Merivale said, stepping forward to stand beside Holmes, his academic authority visible despite his rumpled clothing and agitated manner. I understand perfectly, Miss Ashworth, because you learned these practices from my work, but you have gravely misunderstood what that work describes. May I? He gestured toward the table where Catherine's ritual texts were spread. She nodded slowly, watching him with eyes that held both wariness and something that might have been desperate hope, as though part of her wished to be contradicted, to be released from the terrible course she had set herself. Merivale picked up one of Catherine's carefully copied texts, examining it in the candlelight. This invocation you have transcribed, it is indeed ancient, drawn from fragments of Celtic ritual poetry. But see here, he pointed to specific passages. These lines refer to communal ceremony, to priestesses working in concert, to the blessing of the entire tribe. The solitary practitioner was unknown in authentic practice because such work was too sacred and dangerous to be undertaken alone. By conducting these rituals without proper authority, without community sanction, without the full apparatus of tradition, you are not honouring the ancient ways, but violating them. Catherine's serene expression flickered, doubt creeping in at its edges. But the water calls, she said, her voice less certain. The weeping woman needs her due. My brother James requires the ritual acknowledgement he was denied. Your brother requires your grief and your memory, I said gently, moving to stand beside Sarah Cole, placing myself physically between this frightened girl and whatever violent conclusion Catherine might contemplate. He requires your love and your continued life. He does not require additional deaths committed in his name. That is not honour, but horror, Miss Ashworth. That is not ancient wisdom, but modern madness. The woman who died last night, Holmes said, his voice soft now, almost gentle. Annie Fletcher, she did not transform, Miss Ashworth. She did not become a priestess or intermediary between worlds. She simply drowned, cold and alone in dark water, her life wasted in service of beliefs that have no basis in truth. Is that what you want for Miss Cole here? Another pointless death, another grief added to your own. Catherine's face had gone pale, her hands trembling as they clutched at the table edge for support. But the texts, the rituals, the weeping woman on the bridge. I have seen her, Mr. Holmes. On foggy nights, I have stood on the bridge and heard her weeping, felt her presence, known that she calls for the offerings she has been denied. I have not imagined this. It is real. What you have felt is real, I agreed, speaking as a physician who understood the power of grief and guilt to create sensory experiences. But what you have felt is your own sorrow, Miss Ashworth, projected outward and given form by the suggestive power of legend and your own desperate need for meaning. The weeping woman is not an ancient goddess, but your own heart crying out for relief from unbearable loss. And you cannot ease that loss through ritual murder, no matter how you dress it in ancient language and sacred intention. She stood silent for a long moment, candlelight making her face appear to waver and shift as though it might dissolve entirely. Then, slowly, her legs seemed to give way beneath her, and she sank to her knees, her hands covering her face, a low sound emerging from her throat that might have been a sob or a prayer, or simply the release of intolerable pressure. "James," she whispered through her hands, "my dear brother James, what have I done? What terrible thing have I done in your name?" Mrs. Blackwood's boarding house had transformed from site of potential tragedy to scene of slow recovery. Sarah Cole, released from her white garment and wrapped instead in a warm shawl, sat beside Mary Garrett, both young women holding tea and speaking in low voices about the future, about employment opportunities I had promised to help them find, about the possibility of lives that did not end in the Thames, but continued, however difficult, toward uncertain but real futures. Professor Merivale sat with Catherine in the corner of her small room, speaking softly about grief and delusion, about the seductive power of belief systems that promise transcendence of unbearable pain, about the scholar's responsibility to consider real-world impacts of theoretical work. His voice carried genuine remorse mixed with gentle instruction, and I saw Catherine listening with the attention of a student, as though by understanding how she had arrived at such darkness, she might find the path back toward light. Holmes stood at the attic window, looking out over the dark expanse of the Thames toward Waterloo Bridge, its span illuminated by gas lamps that created a necklace of light across the water. I joined him there, following his gaze to the bridge where so much tragedy had occurred, where legend and reality had intertwined with nearly fatal results. "Do you think there truly is something there, Holmes?" I asked quietly. "Some residue of ancient practice, some echo of all the grief and loss that Bridge has witnessed? Or is it merely legend, fog, and shadow, making patterns we misinterpret as meaning?" Holmes was silent for a moment, his sharp profile still against the darkness beyond the window. When he spoke, his voice carried an uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I am a man of reason, Watson, a believer in material evidence and logical deduction, and yet—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "And yet, London is built upon layer after layer of history, belief, practice, memory. Millions have lived and died here across millennia, leaving behind not only physical artifacts, but something less tangible, a residue of emotion, perhaps, an accumulation of human experience that shapes the places we inhabit in ways we do not fully understand. Is there a weeping woman on Waterloo Bridge? No, not in any literal sense. But is there grief there, loss there, accumulated sorrow from countless tragedies? Perhaps yes, and perhaps those sensitive to such things, those already wounded by loss, can perceive that emotional residue and interpret it according to their needs and fears. A rational explanation for irrational experience, I observed. "The only kind of explanation I can offer," Holmes confirmed with a slight smile. "But sufficient, I think, to encompass both the legend's persistence and Catherine Ashworth's conviction. She felt something real, her own unresolved grief amplified by the suggestive power of location and legend. That it was not what she believed it to be does not make her experience less genuine, or her suffering less worthy of compassion." Below in the street, we heard the arrival of the police vehicle Holmes had requested, come to take Catherine to her sister's home rather than to jail. Lestrade, when Holmes had explained the circumstances, had agreed that Catherine was more patient than criminal, more in need of care than punishment. The death of Annie Fletcher would be recorded as suicide, which in one sense it had been, though a suicide enabled and encouraged by others in ways the law struggled to address. As we prepared to depart, Catherine came to Holmes and took his hand, her face showing the exhaustion that follows the breaking of long obsession. "You have saved me from myself, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, "and saved Sarah Cole, and perhaps others, from the terrible fate I nearly imposed upon them. I cannot yet fully comprehend what I have done. The gulf between intention and action seems impossibly wide. But I know that you have pulled me back from an abyss I had willingly approached. I am in your debt." "You are in no one's debt," Holmes replied gently. "You are merely a woman who loved her brother deeply and was nearly destroyed by grief that found no acceptable outlet. Return to your sister, accept her care and the medical treatment Dr. Watson will recommend, and slowly you will find your way back to yourself. The weeping woman of Waterloo Bridge will fade back into legend, and you will remember her as a fever dream of grief rather than a sacred calling." We descended the long flights of creaking stairs, emerging into the street where London continued its endless life, indifferent to the small drama of salvation just concluded. The police vehicle waited, and Catherine entered it with quiet dignity, accompanied by Mrs. Blackwood, who had volunteered to stay with her until Eleanor Ashworth could be summoned. Mary Garrett and Sarah Cole departed together, carrying the small sums Holmes had pressed upon them, and my card with instructions to call upon me in 2 days' time to discuss employment prospects. Professor Merivale shook Holmes's hand with evident relief. "I shall be considerably more careful in future about the implications of my work," he promised. "The distance between academic theory and practical application is smaller than I had appreciated, and tragedy can emerge from that gap." "The scholar's burden is a heavy one," Holmes agreed. "The responsibility to pursue truth must be balanced against the responsibility to anticipate consequences. But you are a good man, Professor, and I trust you will find that balance." And then, finally, Holmes and I stood alone on the street corner, the Thames flowing invisible but audible in the darkness beyond the buildings, Waterloo Bridge standing its eternal vigil over water and grief, legend and loss. "Shall we walk home?" Holmes suggested. "It is not far, and the night air will clear our minds after such close work with human darkness." I agreed readily, and we set off northward, crossing Waterloo Bridge itself, on our journey back to Baker Street. At the bridge's centre, Holmes paused, looking down at the water flowing beneath, its surface catching reflections of gaslight and moonlight in patterns that shifted and swirled like living things. "Do you hear it, Watson?" he asked quietly. I listened, but heard only the sounds one expects near a river: the lap of water against stone pilings, the distant throb of steam engines, the call of night birds, the whisper of wind. "Hear what, Holmes?" "Precisely," he said with satisfaction. "Nothing but ordinary sounds. No weeping, no ghostly voices, no mystical calls from ancient goddesses. Just a river flowing through a city, doing what rivers do, indifferent to human drama. It is remarkably comforting, that indifference. It means we are free to make our own meanings, to assign our own purposes, rather than being bound by ancient obligations or supernatural demands." We continued our walk, and the bridge gave way to streets and squares. Gas lamps creating pools of light, we passed through like travellers, moving between islands of illumination in a sea of darkness. We spoke little, companionable silence sufficient between old friends who had shared another case, another glimpse into the extraordinary varieties of human experience. The days that followed brought a gradual settling of affairs, like sediment drifting to the bottom of disturbed water, slowly clarifying what had been murky. Catherine Ashworth remained in her sister's care, attended by a physician who specialized in disorders of grief and anxiety. She improved steadily, the breaking of her obsession having removed the framework that had supported her delusion, allowing her natural reason to reassert itself. She would never entirely forgive herself for Annie Fletcher's death, Eleanor told us when she called to thank Holmes. But she had begun to accept that grief and madness had made her someone she was not, and that recovery was possible. Mary Garrett and Sarah Cole. I visited personally, finding them positions in a household whose lady had been widowed and welcomed the company of young women who understood loss. They would not become wealthy or prominent, but they would survive with dignity rather than desperation, and I counted that as sufficient victory. Professor Merivale published an article in the Journal of Antiquarian Studies titled "The Dangers of Romantic Reconstruction: Why Ancient Practices Must Remain Ancient," which became rather more widely read than his previous work, and established him as a voice of caution in archaeological interpretation. Inspector Lestrade closed the case of Annie Fletcher's death as suicide while depressed by illness and poverty, which was true enough in all essentials, even if it omitted certain ritual complexities. Justice, Lestrade told us philosophically, was sometimes better served by mercy than by complete accuracy. And the legend of the weeping woman of Waterloo Bridge continued, as such legends always do, told in pubs and printed in sensational newspapers, growing and changing with each telling, acquiring new details and losing old ones, becoming less about any specific truth and more about the city's endless capacity for mystery and story. It was perhaps 3 weeks after our intervention that Holmes and I found ourselves once more in our Baker Street chambers on an evening that resembled the one when Mrs. Ashworth had first visited us. Rain whispering against windows, fire crackling in the hearth, the comfortable rituals of tea and tobacco, the sense of small sanctuary against the vast city beyond. "Do you believe in ghosts, Holmes?" I asked, the question emerging from thoughts I had been contemplating in the weeks since we had stood on Waterloo Bridge. Holmes looked up from the chemical experiment he had been conducting at his desk, test tubes and burners casting strange shadows across his features. "That is rather a large question for a wet Tuesday evening, Watson." "Humour me," I pressed. "You have investigated countless strange affairs. You have encountered the apparently supernatural numerous times. Have you ever found anything that convinced you of genuine otherworldly presence?" He set down the test tube he had been holding and came to sit across from me, his long fingers steepled thoughtfully. "I have found," he said slowly, "that every apparently supernatural phenomenon I have investigated has yielded to rational explanation upon sufficient analysis. And yet," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "and yet I am not prepared to dismiss entirely the possibility of experiences that transcend current scientific understanding. The human mind is remarkable, Watson, capable of perception and experience far beyond what we can easily explain. If ghosts exist, they exist not as spirits of the dead haunting the living, but as emotional resonances, as accumulated impressions of powerful feelings and significant events that sensitive individuals can sometimes perceive. So, the weeping woman is the accumulated grief of all who have suffered on and near that bridge across the decades, Holmes concluded. Real in its emotional impact, if not in its physical presence. Catherine Ashworth felt something genuine. She simply interpreted it through the framework of her own needs and Professor Merivale's theories. A different person might have felt the same emotional resonance, but interpreted it as simple melancholy, as atmospheric oppression, as nothing more than the natural mood of a foggy night by dark water. A rational explanation that leaves room for mystery, I observed. The only kind worth having, Holmes agreed with a slight smile. Absolute rationalism is as much a delusion as absolute mysticism. The truth, as usual, lies in between, in acknowledging that we do not understand everything, while refusing to abandon reason in favour of supernatural fancy. Rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the city the Thames flowed on in darkness, bearing its burdens and keeping its secrets, indifferent witness to the small dramas of human existence. And on Waterloo Bridge, if one believed the legends, a figure might sometimes be seen in conditions of fog and darkness, weeping for losses that could never be recovered, for debts that could never be paid, for all the sorrow that humans carry and cannot set down. But whether that figure was ghost or legend, supernatural presence or psychological projection, seemed finally less important than the fact that it reminded me, certainly, and perhaps even Holmes, with his great intellect and careful rationalism, that grief is real and powerful, that loss shapes us in ways both visible and hidden, that the boundaries between past and present, between the living and the dead, between reason and emotion, are more permeable than we usually acknowledge. The fire burned lower, requiring my attention with poker and fresh log, and Holmes returned to his chemical experiment, and the evening passed in comfortable silence. Outside, London breathed and shifted and carried on, a city built on layers of history and story, where every bridge and street and building carried memories of countless lives, where mystery and explanation coexisted like shadows and light, each defining the other through contrast. And in that coexistence, in that balance between knowing and wondering, between investigation and acceptance, I found a kind of peace that seemed fitting for the conclusion of a case that had brought us so close to the edges of understanding, to places where certainty gave way to speculation and reason opened onto something deeper and less easily named. The weeping woman of Waterloo Bridge would continue her vigil in story and legend, unaffected by our interventions, unchanged by our investigations. But Catherine Ashworth would heal, Mary Garrett and Sarah Cole would survive, and the Thames would flow on as it always had, carrying away our certainties and leaving behind our questions, patient and eternal and ultimately unknowable, despite all our clever deductions. There was comfort in that unknowing, I found, comfort in the reminder that mystery is not always meant to be solved, but sometimes only to be acknowledged, respected, and carried gently in our hearts, alongside all the other burdens and beauties that make us human. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, its soft tones marking the passage into a new day. Holmes looked up from his work and caught my eye, and in the firelight I saw his slight smile, his acknowledgement that we had done what we could, saved whom we could save, and emerged from darkness back into the light of reason and compassion. A satisfactory conclusion, Watson, he said quietly. Yes, I agreed. Satisfactory indeed. And with that small exchange, the case of the weeping woman of Waterloo Bridge drew to its close, becoming one more story in the extensive chronicle of our adventures together. One more exploration of the boundary where reason meets mystery, where the solid ground of evidence opens onto the deeper waters of human experience, in all its tragedy and transcendence. I hope this story has carried you gently through the hours, has provided that particular combination of engagement and relaxation that allows the mind to drift peacefully towards sleep. The mystery has been solved, the threads drawn together, the characters brought safely through their various dangers to arrive at something resembling peace. It is not the tidy ending of pure fiction, where all questions are answered and all futures are certain, but rather the more honest conclusion of real life, where we do what we can with imperfect understanding and count ourselves fortunate when compassion and reason combine to prevent tragedy. If you have enjoyed this journey through fog-bound Victorian London, through the territories where legend and reality intertwine, I hope you will subscribe to this channel so that more such stories can find their way to you. Leave a like if this tale has provided comfort or entertainment, and know that your listening, your presence here in this quiet space where stories unfold, is appreciated more than simple words can convey. As you drift now towards sleep, let the images we have explored together fade gently into dreams. The rain on windows, the fire in the grate, the Thames flowing eternally through darkness, the gas lamps of London creating small sanctuaries of light against the vast night. Let the mysteries we have contemplated remind you that not everything need be understood to be accepted, that wonder and reason can coexist, that the world is large enough to hold both certainty and uncertainty, both knowing and not knowing. And if, in your dreams tonight, you should happen to find yourself standing on a bridge in fog, hearing the water whisper far below, and perhaps sensing the presence of something sorrowful and ancient nearby, do not fear it. Acknowledge it as part of the vast tapestry of human experience, one thread among countless others, and know that morning will come, bringing with it the return of solid ground and familiar surroundings, the comfort of ordinary life continuing despite all the mysteries that darkness holds. Rest well, dear listener. May your sleep be deep and peaceful, your dreams gentle and kind, and may you wake tomorrow refreshed and ready for whatever adventures your own life holds. Thank you for spending this time with me in the company of Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, and the mysteries of Victorian London. Until we meet again for another tale, I wish you the sweetest of sleeps and the most restorative of rests. Good night, and may the weeping woman's sorrows not disturb your peace, for you are safe and warm, far from cold bridges and dark water, held by the simple comfort of your own bed, your own life, your own continuing story that stretches forward into tomorrows. We cannot yet imagine, but can meet with courage and curiosity when they arrive. Good night.